Well, how's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the New Testament Theologist YouTube channel. I'm Nick, and this is the first attempt at doing a Q&A. And the way this is going to work today or tonight or whenever you watch this is that I've got a bunch of questions from the Patron group where members who are involved in that can ask literally any question they want. And I put that out there a few days in advance, and they're the ones who came up with all of these. And if you want to be involved in that, then check the link in the description so you can get your question in. It's already a really cool experience. 6 people have already just really great questions, really great bunch of theology nerds we have there, and it's really cool. So just a couple bit of housekeeping before. I finally came out and said that that I resigned from my position there and online. It had been said at the church and all that, but I said on Twitter basically, here's what happened. Didn't give any details because I'm not that kind of person, and I think it had like 700 likes and like hundreds of comments from people in my situation or similar situation or have gone through that situation, and it's all a bit overwhelming, to be honest. Going viral for me usually means my mom liked my tweet, or Jonathan Pritchett retweeted me with a snarky comment, and there we go, another angel gets its wings, or a devil loses its horns, depending on which one you prefer. But it's very overwhelming. Social media to me is such a weird beast that anyone would want to follow or like or do anything like that sort of thing. And here I am. We've jumped a ton in subscribers, tons of content, tons of things going on, and just thank you for either being a patron, and if you're not a patron, thank you for watching, and if you haven't subscribed or like this, please do, but if not, hey, I'm just glad you're here. This whole thing, church resignation has been just a very interesting and overwhelming experience, and it's just cool to have all of you here kind of with me on this. So how these work, like I said, we'll do this monthly. So once every month, usually towards the end of the month, I submit basically a hey, what's up, ask your questions bit in Patreon, and people, however many questions they want. Mark put I think it was 10 questions, and I think I might answer all, at least most of them. But if you want to have your question answered, by all means, become a patron and jump in there. And there's, of course, other perks, wallpapers, polls. I put my sermon notes, and I'll be putting up a 9-page little paper bit thing that I wrote in preparation for one of the questions. So this 9 pages is all about one question, which we'll save for the very end. But yeah, and just a little bit of something on questions. If I don't know the answer and I've thought about it for more than a few days, and the most I can give you is an I don't know. That's one of the things about being a New Testament nerd. My focus and expertise is a little limited. It's 27 documents in the New Testament, maybe a few things after. And if you're into Jewish apocalyptic literature, maybe some stuff 100 or so years before the New Testament, or maybe 100 or so years after the New Testament. But questions on systematic theology or philosophy are just not where my expertise is at, and I'm kind of loath to speak on that. I'll happily give my opinion if I have one, and if I think it's a reasonable opinion, but at the end of the day, my friends, I reserve the right to say I don't know. And that's not to shirk responsibility, it's just to be honest. If I don't know something, I'm just going to straight up tell you, and you may get an answer, but know that it's tentative. But yeah, so we're here, and let's get into this. Let me enjoy my beverage tonight. This is just black coffee. Well, not black coffee, a little bit of cream, some sort of weird coconut milk creamer thingy. I don't know what the brand is. It's Kirkland. It's coffee. It's just to get me through this. But so the first question, and I don't know if I got their name, so I'll use their first name, not their last name. And that's something my patron peeps. Let me know in the future if you're cool with me using your full name. If not, that's fine. But I'll do mark these out real quick. I won't use your full name just out of privacy. But if you're cool with that, then I will. But until then, I don't know, so I'm just going to go with that. So Mark asks the first 2 questions. So he says, perhaps you could elaborate on the difference between the different branches of Arminianism. I don't know much about the subject, and you seem to be well informed on the subject. Well, that's very kind of you, and also I wish I was more informed. So, the two, I mean, you've got various kind of sides of the family. They all agree on essentially the same sorts of things. Prevenient grace, the doctrine of prevenient grace, the issue of the freedom of the will, what's called libertarian freedom, total depravity, or at least, varying shades of that. But one of the two or maybe three or four key maybe differences, and these are, of course, generally speaking, these are not exhaustive. There are differences of opinion within camps and nuances to each position. But the four things I see are: one is entire sanctification or Christian perfectionism. That's seems to be a more Wesleyan distinctive than it is with Reformed Arminians. It's not to say Reformed Arminians don't believe it per se, but Wesleyans and kind of the Wesleyan holiness movement seem to kind of favor that doctrine. The other is women in ministry. Reformed Arminians tend to be a little more mixed on that question, and that's not to say, I'm not making a judgment call in terms of people's character, but they do tend to be a little more kind of split on that. The Wesleyan holiness movement has, at least historically, been very egalitarian as it relates to women's ordination and those sorts of questions. But I mean, you have divergent views amongst all of them, but the tendency seems to be there. The other one is apostasy, or losing your salvation, and there's the Wesleyan. We'll say the Wesleyan and the Reformed Arminian. And of course, there's different families that come out of Wesleyanism and Reformed Arminianism, but I'm just using those two as just kind of a brief, just as an easy catch-all. The issue of apostasy is not the issue of apostasy itself. Both sides, generally speaking, affirm it. I mean, you do have some that affirm once saved, always saved, or eternal security, or something like that. But by and large, apostasy, or the possibility of apostasy, is something that Reformed Arminians and Wesleyans agree on. The difference is Reformed Arminians tend to believe that you, and this is just me from what I've read and how I've seen the arguments go, tend to believe that, we'll say maybe Reformed or classical Arminians. So, I don't have his book. Oh, right here. 4 lines. Maybe, and it may just be an issue within both sides. The issue of, once you've committed apostasy, can you come back to the faith? And it all hinges on your interpretation of Hebrews 6, right? It is, the question of Greek tense forms and all that sort of stuff. But the key issue there, it seems to be, the key debate seems to be whether or not, once you've committed apostasy, can you return back or come back? And Wesleyans tend to say yes, and Reformed Arminians tend to say no. But again, there's a lot of wiggle room there, and there's overlap. So it may just be that's an entire debate that neither side has fully come to terms with in terms of here's what the distinctive is, and that's me speaking just from kind of a. I haven't thought a ton about that issue as it relates to differences. I know what I think, and I know what I think Wesley thinks. But so that's that. So those are 3, and one more is one of the jokes is how much Holy Spirit. I've written down is how much Holy Spirit. Wesleyans kind of gave birth to the Pentecostal movement and the charismatic, kind of ideas like that. And the Reformed Arminians tend to be a little more, I don't know quite what the word is, yes, Holy Spirit, but not as much a Holy Spirit as a lot of the Wesleyan side of the family. So maybe that's helpful. And again, these are broad. I'm not saying this is, these are exclusive categories, or that, you can't affirm these different things, but just to give kind of a broad, maybe where some of the key conversations lie within, maybe we would say the Wesleyan, Arminian, Reformed Arminian side of the Christian family. But those distinctions, I think, are much less interesting than the things we actually agree on. So, but that's a good question because it forced me to think a little bit more, and there's a lot more to think about there. So, good question, Mark. And Mark asked a second question, and this is, I think, this is very timely in light of my recent resignation as an associate pastor. He asks, also, I'm curious about your current goals as a theologian. I know you're an author. I wrote one book. I wish I need to write more. But do you pastor or have any other ministries? Do you have a preferred denomination? So I mentioned already the tweet that sort of went viral where I talked about kind of the experience, or at least the aftermath of that. I'm not going to give any details on that, just out of respect. But was a pastor for about 3.5, 4 years, associate pastor. Did a lot of stuff in tech and preaching, teaching, leading Bible studies, curating curriculum, overseeing formation groups, gatherings, stuff like that. And that's what as of right now, I'm looking for another position, preferably in a place like Arizona or Texas, because they seem to be where places are you should go. And they kind of fit what I kind of want to build a family with, around and stuff. But so I'm looking into that. But as of right now, I'm just seeing what's out there and doing this and trying to build this up. And if this thing takes off, then, well, maybe I don't need to find another pastoral job, or maybe I can do something different. I don't know. But so that's just, that's why I think this question is so helpful. Another part of that is one of my goals as a theologian is essentially is teaching and learning. So it's one of those things. I see a lot of people say, I want to teach the Bible. For example, the Mark Driscoll, the Christianity Today thing, right? The rise and fall of Mars Hill. One of the key things that stuck with me, amongst many things, and that really I think it's a really good series, is on. And I have a video on that if y'all are interested. So just look through my videos and you'll see me talking about Mark Driscoll. But one of the things he said was do X and teach the Bible is kind of vocation. And something that struck me when thinking that was, I want to teach the Bible and I want to be a teacher and educator, but I also want to learn. Like, I want to learn. I place a great value on learning and growing and changing my mind, or having what I believe to be true to be shown to be true, or give better evidence for, and all that sort of stuff. So, so yeah, I that's kind of my goal as a theologian. That's hopefully why I'll be able to continue on, maybe doing this. This is something I've actually found I get a lot of joy out of. But yeah, that's kind of the current goal or current idea. That's kind of the kind of strands of thought that are weaving a little bit. And maybe the Lord is tying one together, or tying them all together as we speak. But my denomination was, I'm officially ordained as in the American Baptist Churches USA. I play pretty well with most denominations. I like the Evangelical Covenant Church. My Presbyterian Church, I like ECO, Evangelical Covenant Order of Evangelical Presbyterians, or something like that. I forget the exact one. ECO I could worship there. I like Anglicanism. As I said, I jokingly call myself a Wesleyan Baptist. So I like, the Free Methodist Church, the Wesleyan Church. I have disagreements with how the United Methodist Church is acting right now, but theologically I'm very much in line with kind of classic Wesleyan Methodist theology. So some questions I have here and there, but, I'm open on a lot of it. So yeah, that's officially I'm ordained in the American Baptist Churches USA and licensed as well. So yeah, the two good questions. Thank you, Mark. And Mark has a few more, but we'll get to those. Why it's not a patron, but I thought this was a good question because I get asked this question, a lot. And I think it's a really good question. And Wyatt asks, apologizes that this isn't on topic, but what are the go-to books in support of egalitarianism in Christianity? He says he's kind of on shaky ground as a complementarian and was just looking for some resources. And he says, thank you, and you're welcome. I get this question a lot. Some of the best books, I think, on the subject are for New Testament studies are Philip Payne's Men and Women, One in Christ, published by Zondervan. I think it's a thorough book. I think it's very helpful. The second one is, if you're looking for a little more background material and kind of those sorts of issues, Craig Keener's, I think it's Paul, Women and Wives, or Paul, Wives and Women, one of those. Those I think are helpful. The second one, or the third one, I should say, that is focused on New Testament exegetical stuff, but also kind of a more systematic presentation, meaning The author, she's engaged in systematic theology, biblical theology, and bigger questions in Pauline theology is Cynthia Long Westfall's Paul and Gender, published by, I think it's Baker Academic. So those three, I think, are for a little more technical. They're more technical, but I think they're really helpful. For something that's kind of broad, that answers all the questions and covers all the text, there's a new edition of Discovering Biblical Equality, edited by Ron Pierce, Cynthia Westfall, and Krista McCurland. I know all three of them. They're wonderful, wonderful people. And it's a really good one. It's not super in-depth, but it gives you kind of the broad contours of the debate, as it relates to, say, subordinationism and the Trinity, abortion and egalitarian conceptions of how to, be pro-life and egalitarian, issues of slavery, and of course texts like, 1 Peter, 1 Corinthians 11. So it kind of covers a huge range of materials, and it does so in a winsome and helpful way. And it's the third edition that is just come out. For more, one that I found really, really insightful was William Witt, W-I-T-T. I think it's published with Baylor University Press, is Icons of Christ. As someone who's not as trained in systematic and biblical theology and historical theology as I might like, it's a really good book because it focuses on those sorts of questions of icons in, say, Roman Catholic theology and priesthood and those sorts of issues in that. So those 5 books, I think, are really, really helpful. Varying degrees of, Greek necessity. You need to look. The fortunate thing about a lot of the debate on women in ministry, at least in evangelicalism, is it's a lot of debate over Greek words and what they mean in context. And so it's unfortunate that it's kind of devolved into that, but But on the plus side, it means this channel and other channels that are big on Greek and teaching have a mission in education. So, but it does help to know Greek. But the nice thing about Payne and Westphal is they're very thorough, but they're also very readable, provided you read slowly. I didn't know Greek when I read them, and I went and learned Greek and did a ton of learning, and it was very helpful. It was a good experience. So hopefully that helps Wyatt and others who are interested in a few resources on Christian egalitarianism, and that is the view I hold. Other books, Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, edited by Piper and Grudem, is kind of the standard. You can get that for free, I think, from Desiring God as a PDF. Let's see. Mark asks, what are your eschatological views? Are you secretly a full preterist? I don't have, it's weird. My dissertation is focused very strongly on eschatology, but it's on the question of soteriology and eschatology. So universal salvation and Paul, basically. And it's weird to say I don't really know what view I have in terms of eschatology. It's something I've never really thought about, to be honest. I mean, off and on, but I've never developed a systematic thought to it. I don't think New Testament eschatology is as concerned with kind of how we think of postmillennialism, pre-trib, rapture, those sorts of questions. I think their questions are much different than that. But I'm probably closest to amillennialism and probably furthest from, say, dispensationalism. I was raised in dispensationalist circles. I don't find it to be exegetically or theologically compelling. I mean, Christians believe whatever you want. That's kind of how I view it. Believe whatever you want. Just make sure you're smart about what you believe and actually think about what you believe. But I'm probably closest to amillennialism, and I'm a partial preterist. I'm not a full preterist. The joke I've heard my friend Chris Date with Rethinking Hell, he uses the language, I'm an orthodox preterist. And that's probably where I am too. I think preterism, at least as it relates, or partial preterism as it relates to the Book of Revelation, is probably the most helpful interpretive lens. There's still questions, as with any method of reading texts. But I think it has the least objections, and I find it to be just historically much more satisfying. And part of it is, depending on the date you take for the Book of Revelation, do you take, let's say, 60, 70, or do you take, say, the 90s? I think the evidence suggests the 90s, but I'm not wedded to that. But in any sense, preterism, I think partial preterism makes good sense of the text that we have. So good question, Mark, and something tells me you have a few more of those. Yes, he has 2 more, and these are 2 more right here. Mark asked, Calvinists and I suppose Arminians use the word grace to mean or imply some will-altering power, the human will, the will-altering power. Is this substantiated in Scripture, or do they base the irresistible/prevenient grace on different words in the text of Scripture? It's a good question. I think a way of answering it is, I think grace is often viewed with a very specific reformational lens, and that's not necessarily wrong. But there was a really important book. This is one of those books that is just a game changer. When E.P. Sanders released Paul and Palestinian Judaism in 70s and 80s, it revolutionized Pauline studies, because it essentially argued that Paul was not thinking, or maybe Paul's interlocutors, the people Paul's arguing with in Romans and Galatians, weren't Roman Catholics. They were first century Jews. And to us, that seems kind of novel, or not kind of novel. Seems kind of like, well, duh. But at that point, the reading of Paul being propounded, at least in a lot of, we would say, evangelical or even mainline scholarship, was that Paul was much more involved in Lutheran debates, and Paul was seen as kind of a prototype of Luther in all these sorts of debates and conflicts. And E.P. Sanders basically took a shotgun and blew a couple of holes into that and said no. And we've been kind of refining, tweaking, and accepting Sanders ever since in scholarship. But by and large, the idea was you should go back to the first century and see what arises from there versus reading the Reformation or Wesley or pick your person into the context of what Paul's writing. And so that's E.P. Sanders. But the book that has done the same sort of thing, but in a different way for the word grace, charis in the New Testament, is John Barclay's Paul and the Gift. Paul and the Gift. And it's a 500 or so page book, but it's incredibly readable, incredibly practical, scholarly but accessible. And I remember reading that book in 2015. It rocked my world. It's an amazing book. And essentially he argues that in the New Testament, and this is very broadly conceived, right? But he essentially argues that grace, or charis, in the New Testament denotes a gift given without regard for the status of another. Because in that patron-client culture, there was a sense of reciprocity. If I give you something, if I give you grace or a gift or patronage, you're now obligated to me. There's now a social obligation. There's now a social, implicit or explicit social contract. And what Barclay argues, I think very largely persuasively, is that the New Testament depicts grace as something that's given without regard to the person you're giving it to. So you're not giving it to a friend. Basically you'd only give grace to certain people you want a social relationship with. You wouldn't give it to everyone. In the New Testament, grace is given as a gift to everyone, regardless of their status or economic status or their gender or whomever or whatever. And essentially, and he basically blows that, kind of argues for that. And he also argues for the idea that when you speak of grace, it's not as if there are no strings attached. It is a gift given to you without regard to who you are. But it is a gift given that requires you to act in response to the gift that's given. And that sounds very friendly. If that sounds very friendly to Wesley and Wesleyanism, I think it is. I think it's, I don't know what he believes personally, John Barclay. I know he's a churchman. I know he loves the church. He's a Christian, I believe. But essentially, if we look at grace to mean or apply some will-altering power, that's not quite how it works in the New Testament, by and large. What you see is the grace that's given is meant to prompt a response in terms of relationship. There's no such thing as a free gift, meaning there is social obligation attached to it. But the difference is God gives gifts regardless of who you are. You didn't merit the gift. That's what's so generous about it. You didn't merit it or earn it. But you also now are obligated to respond and participate in the gift or calling or vocation that God has given to you. And often the gift is Christ. And so when we talk about will-altering power, that just doesn't make a lot of sense according to the New Testament. You'd have to look for other kind of ideas or concepts. And I have a video I think it's an hour long. It's on John 1 and prevenient grace. And specifically, the text is John 1:9, where, God, or rather the Word, comes into the world or into the cosmic order and then gives light to every person who is themselves coming into the world, implying that the incarnation is basically God's divine, revelatory, punctiliar, apocalyptic event, right? And I think that works with prevenient grace very well and kind of teaches it. And so I would argue that grace in the New Testament is by and large kind of what I said Barclay's is. But when it comes to prevenient grace, I think that would be more grounded in the incarnation as we see in John 1. And I would encourage you to check out the video. I think I actually argue that pretty strenuously and pretty well. It's pretty wordy, but I'm also a nerd. So I think the word grace itself often is overused and overinterpreted, but in the case of prevenient grace, I think it's a fair understanding, provided it's understood as a complement to other ideas like the incarnation and illumination and those sorts of activities in John 1 as an example. So, good question. The second one, do you have any favorite beer varieties or favored beer varieties? And the question is easy to answer because it depends. It really depends. Depends on the season and the occasion. When it's summer, I love a good, mean, dank, awful IPA. I'm a sucker for just one of those dank IPAs, especially during summer. Fall and winter, I'm a porter guy. Give me a porter, give me a stout. I love it. And in spring, it really depends. If I want to transition back to barley wine or stouts, I'll pretty much drink anything heavy and dark. The one thing I've discovered I don't like after years is I don't like barrel aging. If there is a little barrel aging, that's fine. There's a few beers I go for with that. But by and large, I really don't like barrel aged stouts or whiskey infused. I'd rather just have my whiskey over here and my beer over here. Don't put them together. It does work sometimes, but it rarely, if ever, works for me. It's not my jam. So, great question. Ezekiel asks, let's see. Currently, I don't see how someone can hold to the classical understanding of total depravity without also holding to partial or full regeneration preceding faith. I know Roger Olson holds to something like a partial regeneration, but someone like Brian Abbassiano, Leighton Flowers calls it Abashano, Brian from Society of Evangelical Arminians, would disagree with Olson while still holding to total depravity. And this is a good question because that's not something I've fully thought through. I can see why Olson. I can see the logic of like a partial regeneration or partial restoration, as Olson argues. I would argue, say, that John, like for example, the Gospel of John, right, the beginning of John's Gospel. John doesn't seem as fixated with inability as much as he's fixated with powerlessness. Those who are unable to do something, is that talking about ability or powerlessness? And those are two, I'm not saying they're unrelated, but I think they're two distinctive things that need to be addressed. Because John will use the language of power in very specific ways. Or the Gospel of John, the writer of John. And so I don't know. I don't see, it's one of those questions where I kind of go back and forth. I see the logic on both sides. The classic understanding of total depravity, or at least probably a better way of saying is the reformational view of total depravity, usually kind of implies or brings in total inability. Excuse me. And total inability, I waver on a little bit here and there. I know what people are arguing for, and I get it. But those two things I feel are distinct, or they can be linked, but I think they are distinct concepts. I do affirm total depravity. I think even in the Reformed sense, I think it's true. I think the issue is, can you have revelation? So going back to John 1 in that video, right, that I did. Can you have the revelation that comes in and have people be totally unable to respond, and totally depraved, even in all those senses? But would that revelatory incarnational apocalyptic act, would that itself be regenerative? I find it. So I would lean Probably with Brian on this one instead of Roger, if I can use their first names, obviously. Because I think the sense is, I don't see, I mean, because you could argue, for example, that by means of revelation, the incarnation and the Christ event, we'll call it the Christ event, that doesn't seem to imply their salvation. What it does seem to imply is providing the means of salvation, faith. For those who believed and accepted him, God gave them the right or authority to become children or sons of God. But there is a clear condition, or we might say an if-then. They did this, they did X, Y is the result or consequence of X. And so I think there's a very strong case to be made, not a conclusive case, but a strong case that revelation does not equal regeneration. Regeneration would happen probably in accordance with the response to that revelation. So I would maybe make a distinction between those two, but I'm open to having a different opinion on it. I think I'm probably closer to Brian than Roger on that one. But I think if we ground everything in the Christ event, the incarnation specifically, then that does change the questions we ask. And my question then is, okay, if this revelatory apocalyptic act, born of a virgin, born under the law, all these sorts of things, Christ is born for us. I think then the question is revelation and what happens after revelation, not partial regeneration, and then the question. So it seems like I think revelation needs a much more firm kind of accounting for. So maybe I'm not fully answering the question, although I think it's a really good question. I think it's more a matter of I don't disagree with the question. I'm trying to reformulate the question in a way that accounts for where I'm trying to come from. But I think it's a really good question. Hopefully, and Ezekiel, by all means, next month, if you want to rephrase the question or tell me I've answered it or tell me I've completely botched it, please do. But I think if we reframe it in terms of revelation, then the question of regeneration becomes it becomes a different kind of way of thinking, and maybe that's where I'm coming from. And it's a really good question because I'm having to think about it. It's really helpful. So thank you, Ezekiel. Great question. Ezekiel has a humdinger, what I call a humdinger question later. So don't worry. That's where these go to. And oh yes, okay. I had to print them out because I don't want to be doing this, looking at my computer like this the whole time. So that was Ezekiel. And then Mark had another question. What is your take on the free grace / Lordship salvation debate? Is there a middle position? And my response is I've done literally no research on that. I have no idea. I know it's John MacArthur versus Dallas Theological Seminary. And the more research I did on that question, Mark, the more I was just like, boy, the arguments themselves are not as interesting as the history of this event, this epic of people having this brutal smackdown, Like, the more I research it, the more I'm like, boy, they're asking very different questions, and they're coming from very different places, and oh boy, as a New Testament guy, it's like I feel like I've walked into a completely different continent and culture. It's like I woke up and suddenly I'm in Australia. I'm like, okay, this is a completely different, well, not completely different, but you know what I mean? It's like, boy, this is a very different way of talking, of eating, of driving, of money. Things are different, And so that's kind of my take on the Lordship free grace salvation debate. Is it feels like a completely foreign affair to me. And I feel like it shouldn't be because I probably grew up in that environment. But I wish I had more to say on it, but it's a good question. I wish I had more to say on that. And this one, Mark had a second one right here was, do you prefer any translation or translations, and if so, why? That's a really good one. I have three translations I use by and large. I use the NRSV, the TNIV, which is kind of discontinued, but I think it was sent to the UK and operates as the NIV UK edition, I think. In Bible Gateway, I think that's what it is. And then I also use the CEB, or the Common English Bible. If I'm just doing a straight up, I'm reading a passage and I've got my Greek New Testament here, I'll use the NRSV. I find that NRSV is less intrusive with some of their translations. They're not as, say, biased as the ESV, as we'll see. So I don't feel like I'm having to read the ESV kind of like, now I need to go check, those sorts of things. The NRSV, I think, is just a solid, simple translation. The TNIV I actually enjoy for reading. I think they render the Gospels and a lot of the New Testament very well. I'm not, and the Old Testament's like, okay, that's fine, kind of thing. It's fine. But I find for more just kind of Bible reading, I prefer the TNIV, just because it doesn't sound as dry and academic as the NRSV. I love the Common English Bible's translation of the Old Testament. I don't like how they translate Paul, and I don't like how they translate the Gospels. And that's entirely preferential and entirely stylistic. The way they render the Psalms, I think, is very, very interesting and very unique. And the Old Testament, I think they really capture the nuances of Hebrew very well and make it a much more beautiful, poetic kind of language that Hebrew is. So those are the three. It really just depends on what I'm doing. Academic reading and all that sort of stuff, NRSV. For more just Bible reading and devotion, TNIV by and large. And then if I'm reading, say, from the Old Testament or specifically the Psalms, I will go with the Common English Bible. I think they render it very, very beautifully. My buddy Trevor Stewart, fellow cigar reviewer. Boy, I could use a cigar. That sounds good. Anyway, he asked, do you think ECT, that is Eternal Conscious Torment, Doctrine of Hell, why do you think it's become so popular even though the majority of biblical texts indicate destruction when in context? That's a really good question. I wish I had an easy answer. I think, so for those who don't know, I tend to think that annihilationism, or what's often called conditional immortality, is a more, maybe what's a good word for it? I think it makes best sense of the data we have, and it's very coordinate with Second Temple Judaism. I'm doing some comparative research on Psalms of Solomon. It's actually, I don't know if it's in. I think it's it's in the Pseudepigrapha. I think it is. Oh, I'm tired. But the author sounds very similar to Paul, and the author has the idea of universalism or eternal conscious torment is not at all in this document. This document is just God is going to obliterate the wicked or the sinners. Psalms of Solomon, the author, loves to use the word sinners. Sinners. And Paul sounds very similar to him in, say, 2 Thessalonians 2:9 or other texts. The way doctrine develops is interesting, just because if you look at the early, let's say, pre-Augustine or Augustine, depending on when you are and who you are. There we go. There were a range of views on the topic of, or at least this facet of eschatology. You had the three main ones, and you had some authors that seemed confused or seemed to kind of hold to different or contradictory views on this. Athanasius sounds like a conditionalist. People say he sounds like universalist, but a lot of what it sounds like, at least when I've read it, it sounds like he's more of basically an Arminian conditionalist. God died for everyone. God did all this for the whole human race. Athanasius clearly didn't believe in limited or definite atonement or anything like that. So conditionalism. So Athanasius, I think you can make a good case. Irenaeus, I think you can too. Tertullian certainly didn't believe in annihilationism or universalism. Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, probably closer to universalism. So there were a range of views in the early church that the early church fathers held to. How the doctrine how eternal conscious torment came to be the dominant view, I don't really know. That's a good question. My guess is when you have certain views codified. So, for example, let's say that you have. So we'll use the women in ministry debate as an example. You've got. Oh, I just realized I didn't plug my iTouch in. Well, 1 sec. I knew I was forgetting something when I recorded. Apologies, y'all. Let's see if that records. If not, we'll just go from there. Anyway, we use the women in ministry debate as an example. I think it's helpful. So let's say you've got two competing views in the 1980s, and they're fighting it out in the Evangelical Theological Society. They're hitting each other in the face with lexicons and scholarly articles, some of which is helpful, some of which is just absolute bunk. And then they both write their statements of faith, and churches align, denominations align, parachurches align, all that sort of stuff. And let's say the egalitarians make their case, and a majority of parachurch and seminaries become egalitarian. Let's say, a hefty majority, and a lot of churches and lay people are complementarian. Well, within a generation, the parachurch and the seminaries are sending out pastors into these churches, and let's say, the pastors accept egalitarianism in the seminary and parachurches and all that sort of stuff, right? Well, they go into the churches, and the churches begin to change. And then after time, the churches become more egalitarian, and egalitarianism becomes the norm, whether in churches, parachurches, or seminaries, or denominations, or whatever. And eventually complementarianism either becomes so isolated and small that it doesn't have any impact, or just people lose, or there's just a visceral reaction, and you have basically, a tiny minority of people screaming about stuff. That's just an example, just kind of a hypothetical. But that's probably how doctrine, how the doctrine of eternal conscious torment became codified. It was never the majority view in the sense of like 100%, but it certainly was held by probably most in church history, at least post-Augustine. Universalism and Unitarianism made a resurgence in like the 17 and 1800s after the Reformation. Luther held some weird views, but it sounds like he was probably a believer in eternal conscious torment, even if he said some weird things about soul sleep and the soul. But yeah, it's a good question. Sometimes, it's a good question, but at the end of the day, usually what happens is certain views are prioritized or privileged, and they kind of just codify it, and it gets spread and compounded, and eventually it's the dominant view or the majority view. But at the end of the day, it just takes time. So it's a good question. Another one is from Matt. Matt asked, I'm interested in your take on James and how you reconcile, or not, his understanding of faith, works, and salvation versus how other New Testament writers talk about those things. So, one of the options for my next series on Patreon poll was basically a verse-by-verse study on James, and that was something I was actually doing at church. And so James is kind of fresh for me. We already went through James 2. And just to give a very brief, very cursory 30,000-foot answer, James is saying nothing contradictory with literally anything else Paul ever said. James is not saying anything in contradiction with the synoptics. What James is basically saying, and this may make a few people angry, but I'm just going to say it. James seems to be arguing against the people that believe that once I've said the sinner's prayer, my life doesn't matter. I can keep on doing whatever I'm doing. My life doesn't matter. My works don't matter. The fruits of the Spirit don't matter. I can kind of just keep living as I want to. Jesus, and this might get into the Lordship, salvation versus free grace thing, but Paul seems to be really pressing, or rather James seems to be really pressing against the idea. And it seems like he's arguing with a couple Paulinists, post-Pauline interpreters of Paul, or from his churches, that either were confused or imprecise with their language. And they seem to be arguing that all you need is faith, or something like that. And James is like, no, good works show us that your faith is true, because your faith is actually working and uses the metaphor, as air or spirit is in the body, so too, without works, you have a dead body, you have a corpse. It's not working. There's nothing vital about your faith or your life or your personhood. And so I don't think James is saying anything explicitly contradictory to Paul. I think he's arguing against either a caricature of Paul's theology, because Paul speaks a lot about works, and when he's talking about sanctification and the Christian life. Paul basically saying, no, justification happens by faith, and because justification happens by faith, sanctification and glorification, all these other things happen by works or with agency. And the big thing I think for Paul is, if you do things according to works, then that implicitly suggests that God can be bought by good works or trinkets or gold. And Paul, as a good Jew, as a good Jewish thinker, would soundly reject that. That is why, graven images in the Old Testament, idolatry is very much frowned on. So I don't think it needs to be necessarily reconciled per se. I think we just have a very overly Paulinized view of Christian theology to the exclusion of James, and James is basically asserting a wake-up call and a slap in the face saying, no, your life matters. What you do with your hands matters. What you do with your eyes matters. How you treat people matters. And you'll be judged in accordance with how you've treated people. And Paul says the same thing too. All Christians will stand before we will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account, right? 2 Corinthians 5. And so I don't think they're saying anything that's at odds with each other. And I resent that Protestants have basically thrown James out because it smells Catholic, and Catholics are kind of like, yeah, but Paul, kind of thing. It's like, no, these two authors are speaking about similar issues and having to deal with the problem of antinomianism, so to speak, or a Christianity or a faith that is not guided by holiness, by right action. Because as 2 Corinthians 7:1 says, we need to be perfecting holiness in the fear of Christ and in the fear of God. That's something we are commanded to do, that we should be doing. And so your salvation is assured, but your salvation demands that you actually live out the calling that God has given, and that includes a life of ethical holiness and righteous love. So, not to preach too much. Mark has his final question. And this is a good one before we get to the big one. What, in your estimation, are the biggest problems plaguing Christianity internally and externally? And I could this is its own question, Mark, but it's really good. My patrons are awesome, and not all these folks are my patrons, but I'm so happy that I get to talk theology with these folks. This literally feeds my soul. I love this so much. So I would say there's 4 things. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. One is corporatism. And what I mean by that is the area I work in right now and live in. Most churches, and like medium, and I'm not talking mega churches per se, but like large churches, medium churches, maybe even small churches, are looking more for a CEO than they are a pastor. They want an administrative leader who can give a sermon or a talk. And that's part of Orange County culture here in Southern California. Orange County is very affluent, very a lot of corporations, a lot of business, a lot of money, a lot of all these sorts of things, and it's very highfalutin. I mean, not where I was raised. I was raised, we're definitely blue collar, and still am. Like I'm very blue collar. I've been wearing sweatpants basically ever since I resigned. So, and they're very comfy, and I not the same pair of sweatpants, but anyway. So corporatism, and I think that's a problem because it places the pastor up as a administrator, not a theologian. She's not seen as a theological leader, someone who has theological education. Because if you look at the job description when these go out, almost all of it sounds like you're applying to be a CEO of someplace, and not there's seminary training preferred. It's like, no, seminary training should be required. Or bachelor's degree should be required. Like, you should be theologically educated, biblically literate. And I think that gets us into the second issue I have. So corporatism is a huge issue in and outside the church. Theological illiteracy or biblical illiteracy is another issue because that feeds into the corporatism. And that's one of the things I'm trying to address in this channel is theological education, accessible theological education. And the issue is a lot of people don't know what they believe or why they believe it. And they don't know that what they believe should impact how they live. Everything in the Christian faith, the resurrection of Jesus, the doctrine of the Trinity, sexual holiness, eschatology, like all these different questions and truths, the Spirit's work for us, Christ's atoning death, all these sorts of questions are meant ultimately to guide you in a way that empowers you to live a life that is in perfect imitation of Christ through the Spirit. And theological illiteracy, if you are not literate in theology, you don't know why you believe and what you believe and why it should matter, then the church has essentially failed. And that's a huge internal problem because anything you want to learn in church, you can learn something else in culture. You can learn, and there's all these competing ideologies and thoughts out there. I'm not casting aspersion on ideas. I'm a big believer in the marketplace of ideas and people having conversations and debates and changing your mind if you think you're wrong, or nuancing yourself, or whatever, But theological illiteracy is a huge problem at the church, and that, I think, leads into the third one. My son does, instead of doing 3, he goes like this. So three is easy believism, and I think that's a term that's thrown around a lot and not particularly helpful. But for this conversation, easy believism is more akin to kind of what I mentioned earlier about James. I've signed my name on the dotted line, I've done this, and now my life I'm good. There's no need for sacrifice. There's no need to give up the things that are sinful because Jesus has them, and I'm safe and secure. It's like I become like Han Solo. I'm encased in carbon or whatever it is, and my salvation's carbonized. I'm good. It's like, no, that's not how I think the New Testament views salvation and holiness. And it's easy, and it just feeds into the idea of, again, corporatism. God can be bought. God is cheap. My salvation is easy. And it's like, I don't think God means things to be difficult. But I do think God doesn't give us an out in life. And sometimes bad things happen. And if you have a really uninformed or bad theology about God, or about the problem of evil or of sin, then that easy believism leads to not atheism, but just cynicism, bitterness, and resentment, and all these sorts of things, because I was sold a bill of lies. And it's like, maybe that's true, but there's so much more to the life that you could be living. And so those 3, and then the other one I see internally and externally is partiality. And that's the case with, say, Mark Driscoll. And that's the thing with humanity as well, and I think it's outside the church, is people are always willing to make an exception for the person that's in their theological or political camp. And when they do decide to, grow a pair of stones, find their stones, it's always, this person is expendable, and we don't really need this person anyway, so it doesn't cost anything to give them up. But the sin of partiality, I think, is huge in the church and in culture as well. The church should be a place of justice, of righteousness, that just because you gave a ton of money to the church doesn't mean you get a pass on doing terrible things. Just because you did this or have done these things doesn't give you a pass to treat people like the way you treat them, and those sorts of kind of questions and issues. And so I think those 4 things are kind of some of the biggest problems that are plaguing Christianity internally and externally. Corporatism, theological/biblical literacy, easy believism, and partiality. Because the church should not be a place of partiality or favoritism. And now, those were, quote, the easy ones. It's definitely not easy. I spent a long time thinking about those. So Ezekiel asked a really good question, and now we get to this. So if you want to get a drink of water, we'll be here for a little bit. So, and this document right here, this is almost 4,000 words. It's all blown out, sorry. This document is 4,000 words. And it is accessible as a PDF, or will be accessible as a PDF for my patrons. So if I'm not going to go through the whole document, it'll just take too long. But if you want to read it and disseminate it and use it, just send people back to the Patreon page or my YouTube or whatever. Just make sure people are aware of that. But I'm not going to follow up on that. It's the honor system. But Ezekiel asked a really good question, and it merited a much longer thing. So if you want to read it for yourself, become a patron, or if you can't afford it, email me or something. We'll figure it out. I'm not petty like that. So Ezekiel asks this amazing question, and it's long, but it's worth it. So listen. Why does the ESV render the Greek word appa, Greek preposition appa, in Revelation 13:8 as before, when that preposition only governs the genitive and means from or since, as in almost all other translations? Further, the ESV Study Bible footnotes refer to Revelation 17:8 for support in apo modifying written rather than slain, But there the construction is the same as 13.8, apa kataboles cosmou, from foundation of worlds, from the foundation of the world. And yet the ESV is rendered from instead of before in Revelation 17.8, unlike 13.8. If the perfect tense of written is part of the reasoning for the before translation, so you have the before or the from translation, firstly, why isn't this then translated the same in 17.8 with the same perfect tense of written? And secondly, the perfect tense does denote past completed action, but it is not warranted that the past action could have been over a period of time rather than a singular or maybe punctiliar event or moment, as he says, especially if the better sense of apa is from or since, which inherently carry with them movement away or from or since this moment in time until now. So it's a really long, good, deep question. Ezekiel sent this to me a while back, and I was never able to get to it. Just as you can imagine, life it just got crazy. But so there's a lot of pieces to this question. One is why does the ESV render it this way, and they render it as this. So I can actually pull this up right here. Let me see. ESV. Let's see. So I'll just read what the ESV actually has, and we can go from there. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. So you can see, written before the foundation of the world is the question. Why is it rendered this way? So we'll tackle that first. Basically, and this is easy, the ESV is essentially Calvinist, or the translators and overseers of the translation are Calvinists or friendly to Calvinists. Dr. Clinton Arnold at Talbot's School of Theology, Calvinist. Wayne Grudem, Mr. Calvinist, Mr. Complementarian too. J.I. Packer, Mr. Calvinist. And just others. And there's, just a bunch of Calvinists on there. And I'm not talking about Calvinists being wrong or stupid or having preferences in translation. I mean, every translation does this. Every translation has little biases or little preferences or esoteric things, I'm not saying that's bad, but it seems to be rather obvious that the ESV has a Calvinist and often complementarian bias in certain passages. So I think that's why they translate it like that. I don't think they have good lexical or syntactical or contextual or theological reasons from the passage itself and Revelation itself to make that translation. So that's what we'll talk about now. But I think we just need to mention that bias is it's a human tendency. We all have it. We're not immune from it, but we ought to avoid it as much as possible. So I'm going to do a quick bit on lexicons real quick. Just quick bit on lexicons. For those who know what a lexicon is, it's basically as big as this book and this book combined. Basically gives you a range of meanings and references to Greek words. That's kind of how it is. Often the definition or gloss is applied across and all that sort of stuff. So the whole point is to narrow down the range of possible meanings of a certain word. As you can imagine, that's also fraught with its own issues. And I'm not big on just saying, this lexicon says it, therefore X. It's like, no, lexicons can be wrong. Lexicons can be imprecise. Lexicons are helpful, but they're not determinative. And that's one thing you just learn in seminary is the lexicon says this, but it's like, but that doesn't work in this passage. And that's how life goes. So Lou Nida, one of our key linguistic lexicons, has apa, a marker of dissociation implying a rupture from a former association, from, separated from. And so that's, so that denotes space or location, maybe movement. Freiberg says apa, preposition with the genitive, although in the book of Revelation, it's not true. Apa is governed by, incorrectly, the nominative in one case, but we'll see that. But it's the only one. With the basic meaning separation off, motion away from, to denote separation from a person or place from away, to denote a point from which something begins from, so you would say since, maybe. And it goes on. I have the whole list here, if you want it. Liddell Scott Jones, apa, meaning something like from, like of motion or position. and the Leonida is basically a page long. It's really intense. BDAG, which is Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich, is essentially the standard New Testament lexicon, for better or worse. Basically says, Appa with the genitive, generally as marker of separation from, place, or position as a point of origin, distance from a point, of persons as source and expression of the partitive sense, as a temporal marker, as causal marker with focus on agent or instrumentality. The ball was thrown from his hand to her hand. Beginning of a series, or so on and so forth. But you get kind of a range of meanings. But no major lexicon that I've seen here, and these are I went through a bunch of them, offers the gloss before. And so that doesn't mean Appa cannot mean before, but it does mean none of these lexicons offer before as a possible gloss for it. So you would need to argue, and I think you can do this with any Greek word. I think, for example, the entry on authenteo, to domineer, or often translated as assume authority in 1 Timothy 2:12, or kephale, head language in Paul. Man is the head of woman, and man is the kephale of woman, or God is the kephale of Christ. Really not helpful entries, just because there's so much data that's come out since Bauer, Dankart, and Gingrich, but also the issue of, I don't want to get into it, but basically the idea is there's certain entries in lexicons that are subject to scrutiny as well. But my point is not to belabor the point, but to just show these lexicons seem consistent on what this Greek preposition means and how it functions. So we would need good reason, not insurmountable, but good reason to believe or argue that before makes sense contextually. But just to give a quick range of meanings on this, just as a confirmation of grammar. So the Greek preposition appa has three basic meanings: Matthewson and emig, or emig. Pardon, sorry, Elodie, if I got that wrong. From their intermediate Greek grammar, offer three: separation from, similar to the preposition ek, from or out of; time, from a specific point or act in time; instrumentality, source, cause, or agency. So those three. Stan Porter, who's a Greek grammarian, theologian, linguist, the man literally does everything. The man writes on everything. I love reading Stan Porter. Glosses like locative, movement away from; temporal, time from which; and instrumental, causal, or agentive. So you can see all three are Matheson and Emig and Porter are, there's tweaks, but you'd say they would agree on the range of meanings of this preposition. And there are footnotes in this. So I do cite things. So that's another reason why you'd want to become a patron, or just ask me for it. There you go. So I want to use an example real quick, just to kind of get a sense of it. And so 2 Thessalonians 1:9 is a famous passage in the hell debate, and I'm using it only because Trevor, I call him Stu. He was my one of my groomsmen in my wedding, so good friend, one of my best, most beloved friends, asked that question about hell, and 2 Thessalonians 1:9 is a famous passage, and it says, "They will pay the price of eternal destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might." So obviously not a fun verse to talk about at cocktail parties, but it's in the Bible. So Paul speaks of a divine act, that eternal destruction, and it seems to have its grounding in the Lord's agency. It is something God does. They will pay something that comes from God. So either locative or source is appropriate. They will pay the price of eternal destruction you probably insert something that comes from the Lord, or the presence of the Lord, or that they are even banished from the Lord's presence. I.e. the Lord may be moving in judgment toward or against a nation. Here's an example of elethron, destruction or death or ruin, maybe, being used. 1 Kings 13:37 in the Septuagint speaks of the sin of a household resulting in their, quote, destruction and obliteration from the face of the land. And it uses appa and that face or presence word to denote from a place. Basically, it's almost as if you would say they have been, like a tree is being unrooted and ripped up and burned. That's what's going to happen to them because of this household, because of their sin. And I think that same image is here. They'll pay the price that comes from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. So I think you could say that the agent is the one who inflicts specific judgment, and this judgment has a consequent locative result that from the land or from the Lord's presence. And so it's hard to say whether it conclusively with the Pauline example, but I think it's at least reasonable to say that there's maybe a double meaning there. But in any sense, before would not be a plausible understanding of appa, the Greek preposition, in this passage, 2 Thessalonians 1:9. And some translations in English insert and shut out from. That's overly interpretive of the preposition. The preposition can't bear that weight. You could say something like separated from, but even then, it's just more simple and precise just to say from and allow the person to interpret it for themselves. So it's a translation bit that's overly interpretive. I don't really like having my Bible and overly interpret stuff for me, especially when I know the language. But I think everyone should be a little annoyed when when translators insert certain phrases or sentences to make something clear. It's like that's often unhelpful. And then you have the issue of, the result of eternal destruction is the removal of persons from God's creation, much like the sin of that particular household that was obliterated from the land. In any sense, you have appa functioning in a way that is not coordinate with the idea of before. So, then a second example is Romans 5:14. But death reigned from Adam until Moses. And now you have, of course, a deictic marker, the until. The aorist tense form of reign suggests a period of time in the past, which gives us a contextual clue that appa implies something like reigned from Adam until Moses. So Paul is speaking about a range of time or an epoch, a period of time, and suggests that appa here in Paul retains the normal meaning of from in terms of time. And so that leaves us with the book of Revelation. So I want to do something here where the preposition appa appears over 30 times in Revelation. I could read, I do look at every single, or I believe I looked at every single occurrence. I maybe missed one or two. But I did not find a single instance where it meant before. And so I'm not going to write it. I already wrote this. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I'll just give some kind of, I'll give very cursory. So here we go. Revelation 1, 4, and 5 clearly has cause or agentive at play, and the greetings are from a specific person or agent. And of course, that's where there's a funky grammatical note because you have appa connected with a nominative, which is grammatically not kosher, because literally in the next sentence in verse 5, John uses appa and the genitive, so you're kind of like, John just being funky, as how it goes. Because appa, we remember, goes with the genitive always. Appa plus the genitive. And so, but clearly this is from, there's greetings that come from someone, so there's cause or source there. The same can be said of Revelation 3:12, where the New Jerusalem comes down from my God, so God is the source of it, and it comes down from a place, i.e. in heaven where God is. Revelation 6:4 speaks of the writer removing peace from the land, implying movement in space, i.e. removing the tree from the earth, basically taking it from, indicating space and movement. People are trying to escape from the face of God in Revelation 6:16, as we saw in 2 Thessalonians 1:9. They're trying to get away from God's presence, so implying presence or space and movement, even if it's futile. Revelation 7:2 depicts an angel moving from the eastern or rising sun, indicating movement in space. In a judgment scene, death will flee from them, Revelation 9:6, indicating movement in terms of separation, but we all know death cannot be avoided. Or rather, death will eventually come for them, even if it is fleeing from them now, meaning they are unable to die, they want to die, and they can't. Cause source also fits perfectly the judgment scene in Revelation 9:18, indicating that the three plagues are the source of death, i.e., from these three plagues, a third of humankind died. And that's where appa is. This causal understanding fits Revelation 12:6, as God has a place set for the woman, and this woman tries to escape from the serpent, and Revelation 12:14. But of course, movement and causality or source are not mutually exclusive. There's a little overlap there contextually. Those who are redeemed or ransomed or purchased are moved from a locative sense from one designation to another in Revelation 14:3 through 4. And note, of course, the corporate element of people being purchased or brought out of something as a group from a larger group or locale, from the land or from humanity. So that already is interesting. That seems to denote a corporate kind of aspect of election or chosenness or calling. Revelation 14:13 is really helpful for this discussion because John uses a specific idiom, apa arti, from now or at this point is kind of how it's rendered. It's an idiom. It's used throughout the New Testament to denote time, and it functions as a marker to note a change. So X will not happen until Y, and you can see that in Matthew 23:39. Something must happen, and once it happened until this time, then it indicates a shift of sorts. And here in Revelation 14:13, the idiom inaugurates a new time in which the dead in Christ are blessed. Thus, we have a clear use of time in terms of commencement and beginning. So before doesn't work. It would be better almost to say since, so it's not indicating an act before the event. So Revelation 14:20 uses the preposition to note the movement and expansive metaphorical bloodshed from this space and beyond, basically across, from east to west, so indicating expanse. And then we of course saw the Eastern Sun image, and Revelation 16:12 does that as well. A voice comes from the throne, in Revelation 16:17. Revelation 16:18 is actually really relevant as well. And there were flashes of lightning, battle cries, and thunders, and there was a great earthquake, as there had not been from or since humanity was on the earth, so great was that earthquake. And it goes without saying, Revelation, these are all my own translations. And the significance of this is important because you have humanity being on the earth and then this event happening, as there had not been from or since humanity was on the earth. So humanity is created, then implying some sort of fall, probably, so A, then B, then the great earthquake, C. And so humanity is already on the land, active and presumably post-Eden, unless one wants to posit that earthquakes and battle cries and all that sort of rumblings are part of God's good creation, which I think is a tough sell. But the creation of humanity, anthropoi, is the mark of what follows, the great earthquake. And this event is predetermined, or is not predetermined. Rather, the event follows on the event of humanity and their creation. So as is the case, since is a better indicator of the time and place of when this event happened. It was after a certain point. So it's not before it. Revelation 18:10 is a bit redundant because John uses appa and macrothen to denote kind of far off space, and then you kind of go on and on and on looking at all this. And I think what's the final uses concern the sin of, quote, removing the words from the book and the potential for apostasy when God removes one from the tree of life and the holy city, being removed from something, indicating both source and movement from someone being basically like a tree ripped out and taken away. It seems that Revelation 22:19, specifically where this happens, speaks to the possibility of apostasy and against the predetermined soteriological outcome of the elect having been pre-written into the book of life before the foundation of the world. So Revelation as a whole, all these uses, does not fit the before rendering of appa. It just doesn't. I don't see how it can. And so now let's look. We're not going to look at Revelation 17 because it's already been conceded in the ESV. They render it correctly. They try to argue that there is a predetermined outcome to it, but at the book we just read Revelation 22:19. There's also Revelation 3:5. No, it's a theological pre-commitment at that point. So let's do a bit of recap before we look at Revelation 13:8. Paul uses the preposition most commonly to denote time, space, movement, and causality. He never, as far as I can see, renders it in a way that is compatible at all with the before reading. So that's point one. Point two, Revelation as a whole seems to use the preposition in the same way Paul does. So there's consistency across two different authors or bodies of literature, and those are substantial bodies of literature. 13 epistles, if Paul wrote all of them, and I think he did, and Revelation. That's a big body of literature. Revelation also has two key uses that strongly support the conditionality of the writing of the book, or the persons or the names of the people in the book, and that's Revelation 3:5 and Revelation 22. And this, I think, substantially undermines the ESV's rendering of Revelation 13:8, because it suggests strongly that there's what we would call a level of contingency involved in being in the book of life, as opposed to, say, predetermination, or what some, I learned this from Dr. Tim Stratton, EDD, exhaustive divine determinism. It seems to really undermine that. And Wesley even, I knew I'd keep this around here. Wesley even, although I think he's wrong on this, essentially these are his explanatory notes on the New Testament, which are often very, very helpful, even if, like I said, a bit out of date with scholarship, but still wonderful. He says, concerning Revelation 13:8, and his, he takes it as the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. So Appa is governed by the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. But here he says, the name of those only is written, the name of these only, all will be carried away by the torrent, but the little flock of true believers. And so this is in the context of persecution and suffering. The name of these only is written in the Lamb's book of life, and if any even of these make shipwreck of the faith, he will blot them out of his book, although they are written therein from, that is, before the foundation of the world. So Wesley even grants that the before understanding is true, even if I think he shouldn't. But even then he says there's still contingency because God can blot them out based on activity, sin, all these sorts of things. So it maybe even said Ezekiel and everyone who's watching this that even if we grant the before, that still doesn't get you EDD or determinism of any sort. It just means an act happened, but that act is not so determined as that God can't change or respond or do whatever God wants to do. So there's also other theological questions that we'll get into it a little bit later. But all this to say, we need substantial evidence. The burden of proof is now very high in my mind. That Revelation 13:8 means the use of Appa means before, and so the text reads. And this verse is very difficult to translate because there's so much. It's if you know Greek, it's just difficult to translate. And so I modified Craig Kester because I had my translation, and it didn't make sense to me, just the way it's written. It doesn't feel like the word order is just kind of weird. So I just went with Craig Kester, although I modified it a bit. And all of the ones who dwell on the earth will worship it, the beast, the ones who have not been written since from the time the world was made, in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. So he takes Appa with the Lamb who was slain, which I think is reasonable. I think it's probably better to take it with written before, because I think that mirrors other passages. But I think Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world is theologically very weird, but not impossible, because Revelation is very weird. So I'm not saying, it's weird to me. It doesn't seem to make contextual sense, but it could be what John meant. And if John meant that, then boy, that's a really interesting verse, isn't it? Because some people take it as reference to preexistence. And I affirm the preexistence of Jesus. I think Jesus is, the second person of the Trinity without partiality or subordination or anything like that. But I think the language seems to best cohere with the written aspect, the book. So, but the use of the preposition seems clear because it denotes a sequence centered on time where the books are written, or rather the names are written, and this time is post-creation. That is post-creation, after God is created. One could have used a preposition like pra, see Colossians 1:17a, and he is before all things, meaning he pre-existed all things because he's the creator. And so, that preposition could have been used to denote a time space before the foundation of the world, but John doesn't use that. So John doesn't even use the most common preposition to make that point. So I think just textually, there's just no good reason to affirm the before reading. It's just, I think it's baseless, frankly. I think it's theologically motivated. And the use of the perfect tense, as per Ezekiel's question, is the issue of the tense form, I think, is kind of irrelevant because the ESV seems to presume that a perfect tense equals predetermination, and that's just false. That's not how Greek language works. Simply because an act occurs in the perfect tense doesn't mean an event remains static. That's not how this all works. That's not how it works. It's kind of over-reading Greek grammar at that point. But if they were being consistent, they would render it in the way they do in 17:8, and they don't. So, an additional theological point against the before reading is that based on their actions here, will worship. So these ones will worship. But this is based on their actions on them worshiping. One is forced to ask if this was a predetermined act of God. They're worshiping the beast. Or if God responds via, say, simple foreknowledge, or maybe some form of mental knowledge or Molinism, to what he sees. Either way, the mere act of intentional idolatry here certainly puts one outside the Lamb's Book of Life. And I think that's a reasonable, very obvious interpretation. John doesn't speak of their activity being predetermined or written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Only those whose names are written. And what is this based on? Is this based on God's kind of predetermination, or is this based on God including people in the Lamb's Book of Life and then blotting them out? Because that's consistent with the Old Testament, and it seems to be activity that removes one from the Lamb's Book of Life. Revelation 22:19, Revelation 3:5, and also the Old Testament texts. And I've had an article published on soteriological contingency in the Book of Revelation with, I think it was Evangelical Review of Theology, and I'll post that. Let me make a note of that. Post ERT article in Patreon post. There we go. But anyway, Ezekiel asks the second bit, and I want to answer this question. I think it's helpful. Secondly, the perfect tense does denote, quote, past completed action, but it is not warranted that the past action could have been over a period of time rather than a singular moment, especially if the better sense of appa here is from or since, which inherently carry with them away from or since this moment until time. So I think this is right. Past completed action is true enough kind of as it goes, but it goes too far, at least on the ESV side of things, to ascribe a fixed or static reality to the writing, especially since God threatens to remove people from the book. Like, the mere fact, like you could say, a threat doesn't equal God will do something. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. I don't think that's true. But let's say that, okay, maybe. But the fact that God even threatens to do something like that certainly implies that God has the power and capacity to do something like that, if God believes it is necessary based on worshiping the beast, false idols, and idolatry and sin and stuff like that. A specific completed act, it has been written, or it is written, or what have you, almost requires a sense of continuousness because that act, it's a specific act, but that act carries on until it is completed. Whether that completion involves them being blotted out or making it through to, as John will say, the New Jerusalem. And but that initial act remains unchanged so long as the original agent, in this case God, does not change it. And if God wants to change something, God has the right to do it based on the breaking of the covenant. God is free to remove someone provided said person or group has fallen out of covenant relationship. That's how Revelation seems to view it. I mean, the churches at the beginning of Revelation are threatened with a lot of stuff like that. It is also possible, and this is interesting to me too, that in Christ's singular act of redemption or reconciliation, the entire cosmic order, I think, was kind of put in right relationship with God, meaning the idea is a complete blank slate. God has passed over the sins of old, in Romans 3, 21 through 26. God has passed over the sins of old, forgiving people and establishing Christ as the mercy seat to be accessed through faith. So rather than judging or issuing condemnation, Christ is displayed by God as the new tabernacle, the new temple, the new place of holiness where people can come. And God essentially wipes the ledger clean. And I think that's true in, say, 2 Corinthians 5. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. And the issue is the persistence of sin, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5. You have been reconciled to Christ. We plead, therefore, on Christ's behalf, reconcile yourselves, or be reconciled with God or to God, implying God has achieved reconciliation from God's perspective. God has wiped the ledger clean. God is working to bring creation back to what it originally was intended to be. How do you respond to that? And basically that's where persuasion language comes in, literally 2 Corinthians 5 right there too. There's a missional component, there's an apologetic even component. And you could say, since creation, one could argue, and I would argue, God has been involved in creation in response to the freely given gift of human freedom. The issue of, again, going back to gift language or grace language earlier, is a gift given is a gift. There are requirements or attachments to the gift. You now have to act in a certain way. If God has offered reconciliation, the breaking of that reconciliation offer and life and reality is incredibly detrimental to relationships. And that is why God takes sin so seriously. It's not that God is capricious. It's that God basically says, I'm offering this, I've achieved this, I'm inviting you to participate in this, and instead of doing that, you're doing things that are entirely antithetical to right relationship with me and with humankind. So, in short, I think the ESV is wrong to gloss the preposition or translate the preposition in this way, and since and from is much more precise. And I think it's theologically, contextually, syntactically, and textually appropriate. I think since and from is standard, and the ESV is just flat wrong here. It seems motivated, I think, by a sincere, if mistaken, belief that God elects in a predetermined manner, and sovereignty equals EDD, that exhaustive divine determinism, and which doesn't seem to comport well with John the seer's vision. Now, there are things I think that God predetermines or sets up in advance, the crucifixion, but I think that is more predicated on how God foresees human events and human affairs. And that's how I think God wanted to do it. That's what God desired to do. So the question about the ESV, why the ESV went this route, seems to me it's just theological. There are, and this of course is probably based on other texts like Ephesians 1, John 6, Romans 9, that have kind of a heuristic or theological have been interpreted in such a way as supporting EDD and their gloss of Revelation 13:8. But I think there are better interpretations of those texts. But thank you to my patrons who asked these really awesome questions, made me think really, really hard. This is chicken soup for my soul, or maybe something a little stronger than chicken soup. But in any case, if you want to become a patron and have your question answered, or at least stumbled around, or get an I don't know, maybe I need to create a wallpaper that says Nick Quint sent I don't know. My last name is said Quint, by the way. I had one person reach out and ask. It's Quint. It's not. It's cold like Flint. Quint. But yeah, if you want to be involved in that and building this theological place and ministry and find a really cool place where people love to talk theology and are charitable and all that sort of stuff, I invite you to become a patron. If you can't afford it, I completely get it. Reach out to me and we'll talk and figure something out. If you like this video and made it this far, congratulations. You are now officially a theology nerd, at least until the next time a video comes out. If you like this, like it, share it, sub, and share it around. And yeah, this is the way you grow on YouTube, is just ordinary people doing ordinary things like sharing things. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to Ezekiel and I'll put this back over here. Ezekiel, Stu, my buddy Stu, Mark, Wyatt, Matt. It's just thank you all for your questions and taking the time just to be here. And to all you watch this, thank you for being here as well. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. And if you didn't go to church on Sunday, don't worry. This Sunday's coming up. So just make sure you go to church and make sure you're reading your Bible. I'm reading through Isaiah right now, and I'm loving it. So Blessings to all of you. Take care, and cheers.